Captives of a Concept, chapter 21, entitled Correcting Their Mistake. In order to escape the concept holding Jehovah's Witnesses captive, they will have to correct the mistake that caused them to become captives in the first place. And that is the Watchtower's Bible Study Program, which leads to this captive thought that the society is God's organization. So in order to correct that, they'll need to go back to the beginning and examine what the society had been teaching up until 1919 with the correct interpretation of Matthew chapter 24. So it isn't necessary to prove that the society's pre-1919 teachings were false, because the society already says that some of them were not true. Remember, they never call themselves false anything. So the witnesses really need to look at the society's pre-1919 teachings just the same way as Jesus Christ would have looked at them in 1919, rather than the way the governing body looks at them today. You also have to watch out for that famous Proverbs chapter 4 verse 18, where they claim that the light is getting brighter and brighter. So really, what's important is that even if Proverbs 4:18 did have anything to do with how God progressively reveals truth to his people, the society would first have to pass Jesus' examination in 1919 before that could apply to them. Jehovah's Witnesses are also instructed to teach about their organization as soon as possible. Look at this quote from the November 1990 Kingdom Ministry. Bible students need to get acquainted with the organization of the one flock Jesus spoke about at John chapter 10 verse 16. They must appreciate that identifying themselves with Jehovah's organization is essential to their salvation. Therefore, we should start directing our Bible students to the organization as soon as a Bible study is established. So in the process of teaching someone else that the society is God's organization, they may teach themselves that it isn't. So that's one way we might be able to help witnesses, is on the sly asking for or requesting a Bible study with them. And we want to ask their help to understand Watchtower history. Now remember, the only issue that needs to be discussed is the history of the Watchtower Society in connection with Matthew 24 verses 45 through 47 about the appointment of the faithful slave. And the witnesses should be ready and willing and able to discuss their own religion, because the 2004 January Kingdom Ministry tells them this: when starting a conversation, you will likely have a subject in mind. However, if the person indicates that some other issue is of pressing personal interest, do not hesitate to discuss that instead, if you are able to do so, or offer to return with some helpful information. So remember to let the witnesses be the teachers. And in doing so, they may be able to teach themselves the truth about their organization's history while in the process of trying to teach someone else. Although the witness is the teacher, the student is able to pick the subject. So if we're able to do this and have a history study, then we could be on our way to helping them see the real history of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And there are several advantages to being the student. Just remember, We don't want to defend the society's history. You want them to discover it. So ask open-ended questions and let them do the research. And in doing so, this Watchtower history study, the witnesses won't even realize that it's a history study and not a Bible study, because they'll be counting time, of course. And then that proves whether or not the Watchtower Society is God's organization. And so teaching Watchtower history is not easy for Jehovah's Witnesses. We got to keep that in mind. They're used to having Bible studies out of a book that's been prepared for them. It's been studied by them at the congregation meetings, and they also have weekly sessions to help them to be better teachers of the book. So they're not taught how to have a history study. And so, of course, they haven't studied the history for themselves, and there's not really a program to help them with a history study instead of a Bible study. So most of the information that the witnesses will end up getting comes from the Proclaimer's book, as mentioned in this book. But they also have a newer book that came out in 2014, a simplified version of the Proclaimers of God's Kingdom book, entitled God's Kingdom Rules. So they may begin to defer to that book as well. So the easiest way for witnesses to teach about the society's history is to let people read the Proclaimer's book for themselves. And if you can get that book in your hand, then we have tons of information that we could use. And once the bell has been rung, it cannot be unrung. And remember, the starting point, it's essential that the starting point of the study is their interpretation of Matthew 24, verses 45 through 47. And then we want to hold them to that. Make sure they understand how the society teaches the interpretation of that scripture. But also at the same time, help yourself to avoid making the same mistake that the teacher has already made. Of course, we're already awake. It would be difficult for us to probably make that same mistake again. But the occult is strong. We got to watch out for their devious, crafty acts. So it's possible that there isn't a single witness who realizes that the society's first two presidents never knew about Jesus returning in 1914. Can you imagine that? I would say more than 95% of witnesses probably don't realize that C.T. Russell and J.F. Rutherford didn't know that Jesus returned in 1914, when in fact those two men believed he returned in 1874. So these are some of the things the witnesses have never thought about or never read about. So they are hearing someone else think about these things for them. We could also talk about the faithful and discreet slave, how there wasn't a teaching officially of a slave class until the 40s. So whenever the society teaches about the faithful and discreet slave class prior to the 40s, well, we know that that was a singular person. And then there is the millions now living will never die. We talked about that, how that was very premature and false of the society. And then we talked about that World magazine, where it talked about the end of the world and how they basically chopped off the title to make it look like they had foretold something, when really that wasn't the case. And then we can talk about the Great Pyramid of Giza and how they got measurements from that pyramid to prophesy about 1914 when Jesus would come. They probably do not realize that as well. So the author says, it took me almost 9 years from when I first sensed that something was wrong to when I was able to realize that it meant Watchtower Society was not God's organization. Some of you listening to this have probably been in that same position, that it took you years to really figure out that this isn't God's organization. I came to that realization in about 2 months worth of research. So when a Jehovah's Witness is presented with all of this information, how will they react when they hear what really their life depends on isn't really true? Well, man can only ring the bell for them. They have to really do the rest, and it's really up to them. But if we can get that bell rung, remember, it can't be rung. You can't unlearn the truth about the truth. And eventually, cognitive dissonance will push out the reality that this is God's organization and see the truth about the truth. So if you can, maybe you can try and talk to the witnesses. If you can have a Bible study, that's what's recommended in the book. If you can talk to them in person, on the go, maybe that's a possibility. I choose to do my activism online, and therefore you're listening to my activism. And that's the way I approach it. So this is going to bring an end to this chapter. I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next one.